The sun hung low over the barren desert landscape, casting long shadows over the dry ground. It was a land that was both beautiful and unforgiving. The dust swirled in the hot air, and the wind carried with it the scent of sagebrush and earth. For Nayeli, a strong and proud Apache woman, this land was home. A home that had seen countless battles, many losses, and the deep scars of a divided world. Nayeli was no stranger to hardship. Her people had fought for their freedom and their way of life for generations, but it seemed as though peace was always just out of reach. She was known among her people for her sharp mind and quick thinking. In times of danger, she always knew what to do. But now something had changed. The world she once knew had grown more dangerous, and she was no longer the hunter. She was the hunted. It all started with Lieutenant Edward Conklin. He was a man with a past full of violence and a future that seemed filled with even more. Conklin had been the leader of a group of soldiers who had clashed with Nayeli's people during a raid on a nearby fort. It was a brutal fight that ended with many casualties on both sides, but it was Conklin's hatred for Nayeli that lasted long after the battle. Nayeli had not fought against Conklin's men out of hate, but out of survival. She had always believed in protecting her people and their way of life. But Conklin didn't see it that way. He had grown obsessed with the idea of revenge, convinced that Nayeli had betrayed him in some way. It wasn't enough to leave the past behind. He needed to make sure she paid for it. One cold morning, Nayeli received word from a trusted messenger that Conklin had put a price on her head. The message was clear. Dead or alive, he wanted her captured. The bounty was a heavy one, and the price alone spoke volumes about how much Conklin wanted her gone. Nayeli knew that it wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about power, control, and sending a message to anyone who dared stand up against him. With the threat now hanging over her, Nayeli had no choice but to flee. She left her home in the early hours of the morning before the sun could rise, and made her way into the heart of the desert. She knew the land well, its rocky hills, deep canyons, and hidden caves that offered shelter. But no matter how well she knew the terrain, Nayeli couldn't outrun the soldiers Conklin had sent after her. For days, she rode through the unforgiving desert, trying to stay hidden and keep ahead of the men who were on her trail. She had learned to survive on her own long ago, but this was different. This wasn't a simple fight for food or shelter. It was a fight for her life. As she traveled, the thoughts of her people weighed heavily on her mind. She had always been a leader among them, and now she was running. The shame of it gnawed at her, but there was no other choice. If Conklin caught her, it wouldn't just be her life that would be at risk. It would be the lives of everyone she cared about. The days grew hotter, and the sun beat down mercilessly. The desert seemed endless, stretching for miles with nothing but dry earth and scattered cacti to break the monotony. At night, the temperature dropped sharply and the cold winds would whip across the landscape. But despite the harsh conditions, Nayeli pressed on, determined to stay one step ahead of her pursuers. One evening, as she set up camp near a narrow canyon, she caught sight of movement in the distance. Her heart raced as she crouched low, trying to stay out of view. She watched as a group of riders appeared on the horizon, their figures growing larger as they rode toward her. She recognized the markings on their horses. These were Conklin's men, and they were closing in. Nayeli's first instinct was to run, but she knew she couldn't outrun them forever. The desert was vast, but it was also dangerous. She had to think quickly. She surveyed her surroundings, looking for a way to lose them in the terrain. The canyon ahead looked narrow, and there were a few caves she could use to hide. But she needed to act fast. With her mind racing, Nayeli packed up her belongings and set off toward the canyon. She moved swiftly, keeping low to the ground, making sure not to leave any trace of her presence. As she made her way into the narrow pass, the sound of the riders grew louder. They were getting closer. She reached a small cave just before they could spot her. The entrance was hidden behind a large rock, and inside, the shadows offered some protection from the heat. She ducked inside, breathing heavily, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the sound of horses' hooves getting louder, the soldiers drawing nearer. Nayeli waited, her mind alert and focused. The men passed by the entrance of the cave, their voices carrying in the air. They were close, so close she could almost feel their presence. Her hand instinctively reached for the knife strapped to her side, the cold steel a reminder of the danger she faced. But the soldiers never stopped. After what seemed like an eternity, the sound of their hooves faded into the distance. Nayeli remained still for a long time, not daring to move until she was sure they were gone. She emerged from the cave and scanned the area. The night had fallen and the desert was quiet once again. She knew it was only a matter of time before Conklin's men would return, but for now, she had won this round. As she continued her journey through the desert, Nayeli knew that the path ahead would be dangerous, but she was ready. She had to survive. She had to keep running, not just for herself, but for her people, for everything they had fought for, and so, with the weight of the world on her shoulders, Nayeli pressed on, the desert stretching out before her as she disappeared into the night, marked for death but not yet defeated. The sun rose slowly over the vast horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The desert was quiet in the early morning, the air cool and crisp before the heat of the day took over. John McAllister stood by the edge of his ranch, his boots firmly planted in the dirt. His ranch had been his world for many years now, silent, empty, and lonely. His hands were rough from years of hard work, and his face showed the weight of time. He was a man who had seen much but said little. McAllister wasn't always alone. Years ago he had a family, a wife and a young daughter. But that was before the war with the settlers and the violence that had torn apart everything he cared for. His family was gone now, lost to the harshness of the world. The memory of their faces still haunted him, especially on quiet mornings like this when everything seemed still, almost peaceful. But peace had never lasted for him, and it never would again. The land he owned was far from the nearest town, surrounded by dry hills and sparse shrubs. His ranch had been his refuge, a place where he could escape from the chaos of the outside world. But over time, even this place had become a reminder of what he had lost. He kept to himself, working the land, raising cattle, and rarely speaking to anyone. Life had become routine, and routine had become his comfort. But today was different. As McAllister worked near the barn, he heard the sound of hooves in the distance. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but the sound grew louder, closer. He squinted into the morning light and saw a figure in the distance, someone riding toward him. It wasn't unusual for travelers to pass through, though few came this far out into the desert. McAllister wiped the sweat from his brow and watched as the rider approached. The rider was a woman, unusual in these parts, especially alone. As she came closer, McAllister could make out her features. Her face was dirt-smeared, her hair tangled, but there was a fierceness about her. She didn't look like someone who had come for help. She looked like someone who had come for something else entirely. As she rode up to the ranch, McAllister noticed the tension in her posture. Her horse was tired, and she was too, but her eyes were sharp, constantly scanning the horizon as if she expected danger to come at any moment. Her clothes were worn, her skin darkened from the sun, and she carried herself like someone who had been through a lot, too much for someone so young. The woman slowed her horse as she approached McAllister, and he stood his ground, his expression unreadable. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, she broke the silence. "You live here?" Her voice was rough, like someone who hadn't spoken in days. Her eyes narrowed as she watched him closely. "I do," McAllister replied, his voice steady. He wasn't used to speaking to strangers, especially not strangers who appeared out of nowhere. "What brings you out here?" The woman didn't answer right away. She looked around the ranch as if searching for something. Then in a soft but determined voice she said, "I need a place to hide." "Just for a while." McAllister raised an eyebrow. He wasn't sure if he should offer help. He had learned the hard way that helping strangers often led to trouble. Still, something about her made him hesitate. She wasn't like the usual travelers who passed through. She carried a weight, a sense of danger that he couldn't ignore. "The desert is big," he said, choosing his words carefully. "Why here?" The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she slid off her horse and took a few steps forward, her eyes still scanning the land. McAllister noticed a faint glint in her eyes, a deep sadness that spoke of loss and survival. It reminded him of himself, before the world had broken him. "I'm running from something," she said, her voice low. "From someone. A man named Conklin. He wants me dead." McAllister felt a flicker of recognition at the name. Conklin. He had heard rumors about the man, a soldier with a reputation for cruelty. But he didn't press her for more information. He didn't need to know the details. All that mattered was that this woman was in trouble, and trouble had a way of finding people like him. For a long moment, McAllister studied her. He knew the desert was full of dangers, but it wasn't just the land that was threatening. It was the people. He had learned that lesson too well. But the woman seemed desperate, and there was something about her that made him pause. Maybe it was the look in her eyes. Maybe it was the fact that he saw a bit of himself in her. A survivor, someone fighting just to stay alive. "I can't stay long," she added, almost as if reading his mind. "But I need a place to rest." "I'm not asking for much." McAllister sighed, his mind racing. He knew he shouldn't get involved. But he also knew what it felt like to have nowhere to go. To be hunted by forces bigger than you. He had been there once, and the feeling had stayed with him. This woman, this Nayeli, was in the same position. "All right," McAllister said, finally breaking the silence. "You can stay for now, but you'll have to keep low. There are men out here who won't think twice about shooting." Nayeli gave a small nod, her face showing both relief and gratitude. "Thank you," she said quietly. McAllister didn't say anything more. Instead, he turned and led her to the small cabin near the barn where she could rest for the night. He didn't ask questions about why she was being hunted or who Conklin was. It wasn't his business. But he knew that helping her might cost him more than he was willing to pay. As they walked together toward the cabin, McAllister felt a strange sense of unease. The winds in the desert could change in an instant, and so could the tides of fate. He had lived long enough to know that when trouble came knocking, it never left quietly. But for now, all he could do was offer what little help he could. In a world like this, even the smallest act of kindness could make a difference. And as he glanced over at Nayeli, he couldn't help but wonder, would this be a chance for redemption, or would it drag him back into a fight he had long tried to forget? Days passed, and the heat of the desert became unbearable. The sun rose each morning, painting the sky in fiery reds and oranges, and set each evening, casting long shadows over the land. The desert was a harsh and unforgiving place, yet McAllister had grown used to it. He had worked the land for years, and though his heart was heavy with the past, he found solace in the quiet routine of his life. But now, his peace had been shattered. Nayeli had been staying with him for nearly a week, and in that time McAllister had learned little about her. She kept to herself mostly, only speaking when necessary. She was cautious, always looking over her shoulder, and McAllister could see the fear in her eyes. Whatever had driven her to run from Conklin's men was something deep and painful. Yet he knew better than to ask too many questions. It wasn't his place. Besides, there were far more important things to worry about. The land had become more dangerous for them both. McAllister had seen the dust rising in the distance, a sign of riders on the move. At first, he thought it might just be travelers or a wandering group of cattle herders, but the feeling of unease that had settled in his gut told him otherwise. He had learned to trust his instincts, and they were telling him that something bad was coming. He glanced over at Nayeli, who stood by the barn, watching the horizon. Her sharp eyes had noticed the same thing. She didn't need to say a word for McAllister to know that the men hunting her were drawing closer. She had been quiet since the morning, but the look on her face told him everything. "They're coming," she said, her voice low but steady. McAllister nodded, his jaw tightening. The time for running was over. He knew the men weren't going to stop until they found her. But McAllister wasn't the kind of man who would turn his back on someone in need. He'd learned the hard way that turning away meant the end of something, even if it was just a piece of his soul. He wasn't going to let that happen again, not on his watch. He led Nayeli inside the cabin, and they quickly began making plans. McAllister had been in plenty of tough situations before, but this was different. He was no longer alone. His instincts told him that he needed to protect her, even if it meant putting himself at risk. The thought of running wasn't an option. He couldn't just leave her to fend for herself. "We don't have much time," McAllister said, moving toward the small chest of supplies he kept in the corner of the cabin. He began gathering everything they might need, extra ammunition, water, food. It was a survival instinct, one he had honed over the years, but the fact that he was now preparing for a fight felt strange. His days of conflict felt far behind him, but something inside him stirred, a reminder of the man he used to be. "I'll hide in the canyon," Nayeli said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm but firm. "If they get too close, I can lose them there." It's the only place I know where I can disappear. McAllister didn't argue. He knew she had experience with the land, and the canyon was a perfect place to disappear for a while. But there was a problem. The canyon wasn't far enough. Conklin's men had been scouring the desert for days, and McAllister could feel that the net was tightening around them. They needed a better plan, one that would get them through this without losing everything. "We'll have to fight," McAllister said, his voice steady. "I'll hold them off long enough for you to get to the canyon. Once you're there, I'll make my way around and meet you on the other side. We'll ride out together." Nayeli shook her head. "It's too dangerous. You don't know what Conklin's men are like. They won't stop until they find me." McAllister's eyes hardened. He had known men like Conklin before, ruthless, relentless. But he wasn't going to let that stop him. He had already made up his mind. "I don't care what they're like," McAllister said, his voice colder than the desert night. "They won't take you." The silence between them stretched heavy with the weight of their situation. Nayeli looked at him for a long moment as if weighing his words before nodding. She didn't speak again, but the look in her eyes told him everything he needed to know. She wasn't happy about the plan, but she trusted him. And that trust was all he needed. As the sun sank lower in the sky, McAllister and Nayeli made their final preparations. McAllister saddled his horse and gave Nayeli the extra rifle he had kept in the cabin. She accepted it without hesitation, knowing the fight was coming. Both of them knew that the desert wasn't just a place of survival. It was also a place where enemies came to finish what they started. The wind began to pick up as the sun disappeared behind the hills. The sky turned a deep shade of purple and the stars began to blink into existence. The desert, once calm and still, now felt alive with the promise of danger. McAllister mounted his horse, taking a deep breath, and looked toward Nayeli. "Stay safe," he said, his voice soft but firm. Nayeli nodded. "You too." They parted ways without another word. McAllister rode toward the small rise of hills near the ranch, keeping his eyes on the horizon. He knew Conklin's men were close now. He could hear the distant sound of horses galloping in the dry air. The time had come. As the shadows lengthened, McAllister took cover behind a cluster of rocks and waited. His heart pounded in his chest, but he stayed calm. He knew what he had to do. He could hear the voices of the soldiers as they approached, their laughter and shouts carrying on the wind. They were confident, sure that they were going to find her, but McAllister wasn't going to let that happen. Not on his watch. He waited for the right moment, and when the sound of the horses grew louder, he stood and stepped into their path. The soldiers stopped in their tracks, surprised to see him there. Well, what do we have here?" One of the men sneered, recognizing McAllister from the past. "You're not going any further," McAllister said, his voice steady but cold. "Not while I'm standing in your way." The soldiers drew their weapons, but McAllister was ready. He had learned how to handle men like them long ago. He wasn't afraid. Not anymore. The desert air was dry and thick, clinging to McAllister's skin as he stood facing the soldiers. The horizon was a blur, the last light of day fading quickly into the deepening darkness. McAllister knew he was outnumbered. Conklin's men were too many and their weapons were sharper, but the one thing they didn't have was his resolve. He wasn't going to let them take Nayeli. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, sneered at McAllister. "You really think you can stop us?" the man said, his voice dripping with contempt. "This is bigger than you. It's bigger than her." McAllister didn't flinch. His eyes never left the men in front of him. They were close now, so close that he could hear the soft shift of their horses and see the glint of their weapons in the dying light. His hand tightened around the rifle he carried, but he didn't raise it yet. He wasn't going to make the first move, not unless he had to. "I'm not stopping anyone," McAllister said, his voice steady. "But you're not getting past me." The scarred man raised an eyebrow, looking McAllister over. He didn't see a man who would stand his ground for long. He saw a rancher, someone who probably hadn't had a fight in years, someone who was out of his depth. But McAllister wasn't the man they thought he was, and when the time came, they'd see that. Without warning, the scarred man gave a sharp signal and the soldiers moved in. McAllister's heart began to race, but he stayed calm. He had trained for moments like this. The soldiers were close enough now that McAllister could smell the dust on their clothes, could hear the shifting of their boots as they moved into position. He needed to act quickly. Suddenly, the first soldier lunged toward him, trying to disarm him. McAllister sidestepped, his instincts taking over, and shoved the soldier back hard. The man stumbled, falling into the dirt, but the rest of the soldiers were already drawing their guns. McAllister raised his rifle and fired into the air, sending a warning shot that echoed across the empty land. The soldiers hesitated for just a second, unsure of what he was capable of. "You're making a mistake," McAllister said, his voice calm but firm. "This land's been mine for years. I'm not going to let you take it or her." The soldiers hesitated, but the scarred man was not one to back down. He raised his hand, signaling them to move forward. "We'll take what we came for and then we'll deal with you," he said, his voice low and threatening. McAllister's eyes flicked toward the small cabin behind him where Nayeli was hiding. His heart tightened. He had to buy her more time. He couldn't afford to get distracted. With a swift motion, McAllister ducked behind a rock just as the first bullet zipped past him. He quickly popped his head out and fired back, taking down one of the soldiers who had tried to circle around. The man dropped to the ground and the others froze for a moment, startled by the precision of the shot. McAllister moved again, keeping low, his eyes always on the enemy. He was quick, darting between rocks, using the terrain to his advantage. The soldiers weren't used to fighting in this kind of environment. McAllister had the land on his side, and he knew it better than anyone. He wasn't just defending his ranch, he was defending his way of life. The scarred man was growing frustrated. "This isn't over," he shouted, rallying his men. "Take him down." The remaining soldiers moved in, but McAllister had already made his next move. He'd seen the wagon they had left parked by the side of the hill. With a quick glance, McAllister made his decision. He needed to create a distraction, something that would draw the soldiers' attention away from Nayeli and give her a chance to escape. McAllister moved toward the wagon, firing a few more shots as he went. He reached it just as the soldiers were closing in. He kicked the wheel hard, and with a loud crack, the wooden spokes broke loose. The wagon started to roll down the hill toward the soldiers, crashing into the rocks at the bottom. The sound of splintering wood and the dust that rose into the air gave McAllister the moment he needed. He sprinted toward the cabin, not looking back. His heart raced as he reached the door, throwing it open just as Nayeli appeared, her rifle in hand. She had heard the shots and knew that time was running out. She met McAllister's eyes, and for the briefest moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. "We need to go," McAllister said, breathless. "Now?" Nayeli nodded, her face set in determination. She didn't need to be told twice. She had already been running for too long. She grabbed her things quickly and followed McAllister outside, where the sounds of gunfire were still echoing in the distance. They were too close now. They needed to leave. Together they mounted their horses, and McAllister urged his horse into a gallop, leading the way toward the narrow canyon they had discussed earlier. Nayeli followed, her eyes constantly scanning the horizon. The soldiers had to be getting close. As they rode, the sounds of the battle faded behind them. The desert stretched out ahead, dark and endless. The canyon was just a few miles away, and they could make it there if they were fast enough. But McAllister knew they didn't have much time. He could hear the pounding hooves of the soldiers behind them, still chasing, still determined to catch them. But McAllister wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. As they reached the mouth of the canyon, McAllister glanced over at Nayeli. "We'll stop here for now. They'll think we're headed in another direction." Nayeli nodded. She knew that the canyon would offer them some cover, but they couldn't stay here long. They had to keep moving. They dismounted and took cover in the narrow rocky pass that led deeper into the canyon. McAllister looked back toward the open desert. His eyes narrowed. The soldiers would be coming soon. "We'll need to make our stand here," McAllister said, his voice low but sure. "This is the only place left where we have a chance." The wind howled through the canyon, and the distant sounds of the soldiers' pursuit echoed off the walls. McAllister could feel the tension building. He wasn't sure how much longer they could hold out, but one thing was certain: they weren't giving up without a fight. The canyon was eerily quiet now, the only sound the distant whistle of the wind as it swept through the narrow rock walls. McAllister and Nayeli crouched behind the jagged stone, their horses tethered to a nearby rock. Their breath was shallow and their eyes were constantly scanning the horizon. The soldiers were getting closer. McAllister could hear the faint sound of horses approaching from the distance. They were coming, and they weren't far off. McAllister glanced over at Nayeli. Her face was set in determination, her eyes hard with the weight of the danger that still hung over them. But there was something else in her expression. Something that had been missing the last time they had spoken. The look of someone who had accepted the fight, who was ready for whatever came next. "We can't let them catch us," McAllister whispered, his voice low but steady. "I know," Nayeli said, her gaze not leaving the distance. "We won't let them." The canyon offered them some protection, but McAllister knew that hiding wasn't a permanent solution. They had to keep moving, keep one step ahead. The soldiers were relentless, and if they stayed here too long, they would be surrounded. They had a small window of time. Maybe an hour, maybe less. McAllister looked around, weighing his options. The canyon was deep and narrow, but it eventually opened into a wider desert valley on the other side. If they could make it there, they might be able to lose the soldiers in the open land. But the challenge was getting there without being caught. Nayeli spoke up as if reading his mind. "There's a pass on the other side of the canyon. It's hard to spot from a distance. We can make it through there." McAllister nodded. He trusted her judgment. She knew this land better than anyone. "Let's move quickly then." They stood up, carefully making their way down the narrow path, moving swiftly but silently. The sound of hooves was louder now, closer. McAllister's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to stay calm. The soldiers were out there, but they didn't have to know exactly where he and Nayeli were. The canyon's twists and turns would help keep them hidden, at least for a while. As they reached the end of the canyon, they ducked into a small, hidden pass. McAllister glanced over at Nayeli, who gave him a small nod. She led the way through the rocky passage, her movements swift and sure. The pass was steep and narrow, but they kept going, knowing that every second counted. Behind them, the sound of the soldiers' horses echoed louder. They were getting closer. McAllister pushed forward, his mind racing with plans. If they could make it to the open valley, they might have a chance to outrun them. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Conklin's men wouldn't stop. Not until they had what they wanted. And they wouldn't just stop at her. They would keep coming for him too. But there was no time to dwell on that now. They were almost at the end of the pass. As McAllister and Nayeli emerged from the narrow path, they found themselves in a wide, open desert valley. The wind howled across the land, pushing the sand in every direction. The landscape stretched out before them, vast, empty, and unforgiving. "We have to move now," McAllister said, his voice urgent. They spurred their horses into a gallop, the pounding hooves kicking up the sand behind them. The soldiers would be able to track them, but for now they had a head start. The valley seemed endless, but McAllister knew that they couldn't outrun Conklin's men forever. He just needed to keep pushing. He glanced over at Nayeli, who was riding beside him. Her eyes were focused, determined. She wasn't giving up, and neither was he. They rode for what felt like hours, their horses tiring under the heavy load of the chase. But McAllister couldn't afford to stop. Not yet. As they reached a ridge of rocks, he pulled his horse to a halt, signaling Nayeli to stop as well. "We'll make our stand here," McAllister said, his voice steady. Nayeli looked at him, her brow furrowing slightly. "You sure?" McAllister nodded. "They'll expect us to keep running. If we stay here, we might have a chance to turn the tables." It wasn't a perfect plan, but it was the only one they had. The soldiers were closing in, and McAllister had no intention of going down without a fight. They dismounted and took cover behind the rocks, their horses tethered nearby. McAllister checked his rifle, making sure it was loaded, and handed Nayeli the extra pistol he had kept with him. She accepted it without a word. They didn't need to say anything. They both knew what was coming. The sound of hooves grew louder. The soldiers were getting closer, riding hard, determined to catch them. McAllister's heart pounded in his chest, but he remained calm. He had been in dangerous situations before. He had learned to think quickly, to stay focused in the face of danger. Then the soldiers appeared over the ridge, their horses silhouetted against the setting sun. They stopped when they saw McAllister and Nayeli waiting for them. The scarred man, still leading the group, sneered as he saw them. "You think you can stop us?" the man called out, his voice dripping with disdain. "We'll stop you if we have to," McAllister said, his voice steady. For a long moment, the two sides faced each other across the open space. McAllister knew that there was no more running. This was it. It was time to stand and fight. Then, as if on cue, the soldiers began to move, circling around them, preparing to strike. McAllister raised his rifle, aiming carefully at the leader of the group, the scarred man. A single shot rang out, echoing through the valley. The scarred man fell from his horse, and the others froze, stunned by the sudden turn of events. Nayeli fired as well, taking down another soldier who had tried to move in on them. The soldiers hesitated, unsure of how to proceed. McAllister and Nayeli had turned the tables, and for the first time they had the advantage. The remaining soldiers, realizing they were outmatched, began to retreat, pulling back in confusion. McAllister and Nayeli didn't chase them. They had won this round. As the last of the soldiers disappeared into the distance, McAllister let out a long breath. He turned to Nayeli, who was still watching the horizon. "We did it," he said, a sense of relief washing over him. Nayeli nodded, but there was no smile on her face. "We have time now," she said softly. "But the world we knew is gone. I can't go back." McAllister understood. She had lost too much. But for the first time in a long while, he felt hope stir in his chest. "Then we make a new one," McAllister said, looking at her with determination. Together. The sun set behind them, casting long shadows over the desert. And as they stood there side by side, McAllister and Nayeli knew that their journey was far from over. But this time they would face it together, not as fugitives, but as two people who had found something worth fighting for.